Hi everyone, my name is Sandra Osorio, and today I'll be talking about the effects of tannins on beef production and greenhouse gas emissions. Several research out there has shown that tannins have the ability to decrease greenhouse gas emissions from both the animal as well as from excreta. When I'm talking about excreta, I'm referring to urine as well as fecal emissions. And in addition to that, it has been proven that utilization of tannins can actually increase performance of cattle. And in addition, it can increase digestibility of protein. So first, I want to start with just an introduction of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the US. How you can observe here, most of them are related to human activities, and only about 10% of them or less than that is reflected in the agriculture sector. However, as you can observe here, agricultural livestock, we talk about swine, poultry, as well as cattle and other ag and animals, only accounts for 3.9% of the total US greenhouse gas emissions. And when we only account for beef cattle, it only represents around 2 and 3% of the total US greenhouse gas emissions. This includes methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. So as you can observe, beef cattle actually don't have that great of an impact when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So I want to explain how and why ruminants produce methane. So over here we have the rumen, we have a sear here, and over here you can observe the rumen, which is a fermentation sac. It has anaerobic conditions, which means that there is little presence of oxygen. So this animal consumes its feed, it's fermented by the microorganisms that live inside the rumen, and whenever this fermentation occurs, volatile fatty acids, or how I'm going to call them VFAs, are produced. The main ones will be acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And these are important because these are the main source of energy for that ruminant animal when compared to us that we use glucose. And whenever these volatile fatty acids are produced, there's also production of CO2 and hydrogen. And that's when our methanogens come into play. And what they do is like they grab that CO2 and hydrogen within the rumen environment, put it together, and form methane. And the reason why they do that is because they want to stabilize ruminal pH, and at the same time, by doing that, they allow other microorganisms and themselves to have ideal fermentation environments or an ideal rumen environment. So that's why methane is produced. And most of it will be belched or eructated due to this fermentation that occurs in the rumen. And only 5% of the methane produced by the animal will be post-ruminally, so produced in the large intestine. So I already told you guys that ruminants do not produce that much greenhouse gas emissions. So I want to explain to you why, as researchers and nutritionists, we care about that. And we care about this because it represents a loss of gross energy intake. So between 2 to 12% of the gross energy intake can be lost as methane emissions. Being concentrate-based diets closer to that 2%, and forage-based diets closer to the 12%. And what this means is that about 2 to 12% that producer invests in feed is just gone in the atmosphere as methane. So what we want to do, as you can observe, methane has carbon in its molecule. What we want to do as nutritionists and researchers is like to try to retain as much carbon as we can and not use it for methane. So in that manner, we can increase milk production, as well we can increase meat production or performance from the animal. When we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, something to consider as well are excreta emissions, because this can be very significant, especially in our livestock sector. So greenhouse gas emissions from excreta are generated through microbial decomposition of organic matter. And whenever the whole production system from livestock is accounted, so over here, feed production, growth of cattle management, and animal excrete emissions, then livestock do contribute to 8 to 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Sorry, it's not livestock, it's actually just cattle. And researchers have observed that about 25% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from beef production comes from manure in pens and housing, which is. However, as researchers and also the industry has looked for different mitigation, methane options such as nitrates, ionophores, and tannins, oils, feedings, and feeding strategies to improve cattle performance and at the same time decrease greenhouse gas emissions. Today, I'm going to be talking about tannins. And what are tannins? Tannins are secondary plant products generally found in soils or vacuums of stems, bark, leaves, flowers, or seeds of the cotyledon plant. We have condensed tannins, and a classic example about condensed tannins is acacia trees, and hydrolyzable tannins will be oak trees. Some positive effects of tannins, because whenever you ask a producer, they will say like these are anti-nutritional factors, and indeed they are. However, whenever they are fed in high concentrations, so over 50 grams per kilogram of dry matter, in that time, it can be harmful for the animal, or it can decrease performance, and as well, it can decrease dry matter intake. So tannins can increase the quantity of protein, especially essential amino acids, flowing to the small intestine. What tannins does is that they protect that protein within the rumen and let it pass to the small intestine where we want it to be absorbed. In addition, whenever it's fed to low to medium concentrations, it can be observed that it can improve utilization of the protein without impairing feed intake or carbohydrate digestibility. And this is of great importance because usually protein is the most expensive component in ruminant diets. So I want to explain as well how tannins decrease greenhouse gas emissions, and there are different theories about that. There's still not a specific mode of action on how it does it. So tannins can act directly on methanogens. Also, they can affect protozoa, which are associated with methanogens. And also they can act on fibrolytic bacteria and decrease fiber degradation, or they can act as a hydrogen sink. These are the four main hypotheses on how they decrease greenhouse gas emissions, or methane in this case. And right now I'm going to show some research that reflects how methane emissions can be mitigated with tannins. For example, Woodward and others, they observed that by providing Lotus corniculatus, which is a legume, with the high concentrations of tannins, those cows consuming the lotus decreased by 17% methane production whenever they were compared to ryegrass. And in that same experiment, the cows consuming the lotus increased milk yield by 32% when compared to the ryegrass. Another experiment with goats, goats consuming Lespedeza, which is another legume with high concentration of tannins, produced 57% less methane emissions when compared to the control treatment. And in a feedlot trial, whenever cattle was supplemented with tannins at 0.6% of the dry matter intake, average to the gain to feed ratio, and also increasing dietary net energy increase as well with the use of tannins. And when it comes to excrete emissions, there's little data, but there are actually very good results within this area. So cows consuming condensed tannins 4 and 8% weight basis, they reduce manure methane emissions by 68%, which is very significant. This is for excrete emissions. And in addition, that same experiment, they observed that the combination of both hydrolyzable and condensed tannins led to a reduction in nitrous oxide emissions from manure. And these are the main, nitrous oxide is very important when it comes to excrete emissions because it can last in the atmosphere up to 200 years. And in another experiment, they used tannin-based powders, and those tannin-based powders reduce pH and decrease ammonia emissions by 90% from slurry of beef cattle. So overall thoughts about tannins is that they have a great potential to increase animal performance. And also by doing this, it can help the producer to have more profit in a sustainable manner. Thank you for watching my video.